silence in the cave of my heart. Restore, restore, restore my soul. Sitting in silence in the cave of my heart. Restore, restore, restore my soul. Deep in the cave of my heart, restore, restore, restore my soul. Deep in the cave of my heart, restore, restore.
So rediscovering the labyrinth was quite an adventure, and it unfolded over several months. It started, or at least my intuitive search started, for some way for people to be able to be together. I came as canon pastor of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco in 1986. By 1987, we had our first death from AIDS. By 1989, not only did we have the earthquake, we also had 92 deaths in the broad congregation in San Francisco. And so people were going through all sorts of things they couldn't talk about. People, the worried well, for sure. Parents coming to be with their dying adult child in San Francisco. And by 1991, I was really burnt out. Administration isn't my thing, and we were just, the whole staff of the cathedral was overwhelmed. But it felt to me like, wow, someone else could step in and do a better job. I had a month sabbatical, and I found my way back to Jean Houston, whom I had worked with in 1985. And then I went to the conference that I had attended earlier, and that was the first time that she introduced the labyrinth. And I kind of always knew there was a labyrinth in Chartres Cathedral, but I don't know where I got that piece of information. The 6 of us walked it, but also we were joined by about 25 people, just tourists, people who were looking and walking through Chartres Cathedral. And then at that time, in that first walking, it was just like someone had taken stardust and thrown it into the air. There was this feeling of joy in the air. And it just felt joyous. The whole process felt joyous. And so when I went back to Grace Cathedral, at first I thought, wow, I could work with the content that Jean worked with. And then there was this feeling that some idea was chasing me down. You talk about the hound of heaven. Some idea was chasing me down. And the thought came in, put the labyrinth in the cathedral. And then I realized, well, I have a cathedral handy in my life, and that's what's supposed to happen.
Yeah, so the first time I walked the labyrinth was in Sydney, and my niece Emily she'd been having a tough time, and she'd been in San Francisco, and she discovered the labyrinth in Grace Cathedral, and she walked it, and as she says, she fell in love with it, and she came back to Sydney with a vision to put a replica of the Chartres Cathedral labyrinth in one of our big public parks. When she'd set up a canvas labyrinth in a beautiful building with candlelight all around, and I came in and I was at a really end of my life. It was the end of my marriage. I just that day put the family home on the market, so I was losing neighbours and people we'd known for 30 years and having to move, and also my mother was dying, so I was really, just in despair. And I looked at the labyrinth and looked a bit like a maze, but I understood it was one path, so I stepped in there. And as I started walking, I just found the tears just rolling down my cheeks. And I just walked, and we had some beautiful music playing. And I stood in the centre and felt silence. And then as I walked out again, I don't know, somehow I just had this sense of hope somehow, and trust, and somehow, like the labyrinth, you go step by step. So somehow, and there's twists and turns, and everything's not what you expect, and it's like a metaphor for our life. But I just kind of realised, or something shifted in me, I just somehow knew that, or felt that there was a sense of hope, and that somehow all this, I would somehow move through it.
What I began to realize over the months and years of working with the labyrinth is that the labyrinth really addresses the spiritual hunger of our times. People are looking for something more than belief. They're looking for what I would call a raw experience of the holy. That you can have a direct connect when you're walking the labyrinth. You can have a sense of being loved, of being connected to Source. Your prayer life becomes dynamic. And as you're walking it, because the body's moving, the mind quiets much easier. And that's really one of the greatest challenges of the Western mind right now, because we're so distracted and pulled off center, and we can't very easily direct our attention. And this is, of course, what meditation is all about, to be able to quiet the mind. You can't shut the mind off, but you can quiet it enough to be able to have a sense of how you want to direct your thoughts. You might want to direct your thoughts in prayer. But if you're so distracted, that's a hard thing to do. And so the key is moving your body. And then we began to discover that this spoke to a lot of people. And because that's where the hunger is. Being able to feel some kind of sense of relationship in people's faith journey. Or people who don't ever kind of darken the door of a church began to come to the labyrinth when we had it open, because it allowed people to feel centered and grounded. And the benefits of a quiet mind, I mean, we know about that, and research is certainly pointing us toward that. In 1997, we began to train people. I had by this time created the nonprofit Veriditas, and Veriditas started at Grace Cathedral, and with Grace Cathedral's blessing, and then we began to realize, wow, people need to be trained. They want to use the labyrinth. They want to introduce it to their communities.
Drink deeply, drink deeply. The well is a water, the well is a fire. The well is a water, the well is a fire. Drink deeply, drink deeply.
I'd like to invite you to open your eyes and to look around the circle and just see the beautiful people who have been together with us this afternoon on this ancient pathway of peace and wholeness.
But the place that really kind of birthed my coming into labyrinth awareness was this design at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And while I was working on my doctorate, me and two of my classmates, we went every other weekend to Grace Cathedral and walked the labyrinths, the Chartres design there. So I feel like it really prepared me. There was this one walk, and it was November of 1996. I literally felt like the labyrinth welled up, and I was like on a wave pushed out, and I heard, "Go home and write your dissertation." I really feel that the walking of the Chartres design laid the template, the learning about sacred geometry and the flower of life, that those all kind of played a part in piquing, I would say, my curiosity, like, could I make something like this? And to have that well up inside of me was such an incredible experience.
Approchez-vous. Parce que là, vous êtes nombreux, vu que lui, il tape sur son bout de bois là, tout pourri.
So this is the medieval Chartres labyrinth from the cathedral in France. And it is a variation of that pattern. This is the 5-circuit Chartres labyrinth. So basically, if you started in the center and created the first 5 pathways, that is the sequence of this. So it's basically a half of a Chartres labyrinth in some ways. It's smaller also to fit into this space. So the center is not the typical size, but the path width and the line width is the same as in the cathedral. So the path width is 13.5 inches and the line is 3 inches. And we've also incorporated other geometry, like the center is 1/4 of the diameter. So we've done our best to make a replica that models after the geometry and proportions. It's just been modified for the space here. And what we did was we taped out concentric circles in masking tape, and then we created the turns and entrance, then the lunations around the perimeter, the kind of symbolic outside, and then the center rosette. And it took 2 days to tape out the labyrinth in negative. You know, we created a custom template using geometry right on site. And then today we are coloring the design. So we are filling in between the masking tape with the crushed stone, granitite is what it's called. And we have volunteers from the church and the community that are helping, and my assistant John today. And so we've applied the crushed stone, and now we're going to pull the tape, and the pattern will reveal itself.
So labyrinths exist in cultures all over the world throughout time. And some of the earliest stories that we have actually go back to the island of Knossos. And there in Cretan culture, we found these coins that exist with this one-way pathway that goes on the coins. And they indicate that there's some literary references about there being a dancing floor on the island of Knossos, and that this was the labyrinth. A dancing floor that was probably used for rituals, and most likely for rituals dedicated to the goddess Ariadne and her consort Dionysus at one point. By the time we get to Greek culture, that myth had changed, and the labyrinth became this place of fear, and it's associated with these myths of the Minotaur, which was a monstrous beast that was half bull and half human, and that devoured human flesh and required human sacrifice. In those stories, the labyrinth is a place of terror, actually. During the High Middle Ages, the labyrinth began to take on new significance, particularly in Chartres Cathedral. Chartres in France had been the site of the greatest wisdom school for hundreds of years before there were universities. It was the place that was the repository that held the memory of the wisdom of the ancient Greek path, the philosophers, that great tradition, and even the mythology. The decision was made to place the labyrinth in the center of this great cathedral, on the floor. The labyrinth now became a pathway of Christian prayer, and yet evidence suggests that at the center of this amazing, astonishing pattern, there might still have been a bronze plaque that had either the head of a bull or even a minotaur-like figure. Now, this then takes on a different kind of significance, this walking a pathway in contemplation and Christian prayer begins to suggest, again, a pathway of personal transformation. There are some remarkable traditions that survive from the Middle Ages that now imagine somehow this labyrinth pattern as being evocative of the Christian journey. We have stories that the pathway was said to symbolically represent Jesus' journey to the cross. It was called the New Jerusalem. And petitioners would sometimes crawl this pathway on their knees, and yet somehow the memory of the dance from Knossos also stayed alive. So my favorite tradition from the Middle Ages involved the celebration of Easter. The bishop would begin a processional dance with all of the congregants, and they would wind their way in a communal dance at Easter around these different pathways here to the center. And once in the center, the bishop would take a big ball and toss it to the different people who were surrounding. This is clearly an evocation of Ariadne and Ariadne's thread, and a remembrance of those mythic stories of Ariadne and the labyrinth as a dancing ground of communal celebration. And so the labyrinth became this pathway of astonishing celebration and transformation.
And so the training has been really helpful in placing facilitators in hospitals. There's over 250 labyrinths and counting in hospitals. The first spa that put one in was the Golden Door Spa down in Escondido, California. They're in prisons. Salinas, California has one in their prison. That's a little slower going, but usually comes through the chaplain's office. So in parks and playgrounds and in schools, because it's something that walking the labyrinth is something that people can do collectively, also alone. But in that, the walking is what quiets the mind and opens the heart.
Well, this design is a basic seed pattern. It has the 4 directions. That's the basic cross or the X. And then it has 4 seeds at the middle parts of wherever it is, for example. And then I just start connecting it. And the first move can be done to the left or to the right. And the entrance will be the opposite of that. And so this is something that I can make any place, most any place, whether it's in dirt or here on the beach where there's sand. And it allows me to have a labyrinth experience wherever I am. And it's just a delightful thing for me. It gives me an access to myself. I think that's what the most moving thing for me is. And when that happens, I'm more able and more accessible to other people, and other people are more accessible to me.
So the labyrinth came to me about 30 years ago in a church. And then I was fascinated with how does walking this pattern bring up so many questions in my mind. And then later on it helped me to process things that I was struggling with, that I had challenges with in my life. It gave me a way to integrate some things that I had been struggling with. So now I use it as a meditation tool and also as a integration piece after grief rituals. Because I find that after a ritual, there's a need for integration time that we can give each other and witness each other with. And the labyrinth is a great way to do it because it's like sorrow and grief. It's an individual journey, but it's one we all take together, even though we experience it on our own individually. But once that gets witnessed, then we have a way of integrating it that feels healthy. we're going to experience loss at various times. And if we can find a way to process it and integrate it, then hopefully we're stronger because of it.
My first book, Walking a Sacred Path, Rediscovering the Labyrinth as a Spiritual Practice, came out in 1995. And from that time on, phone calls coming in, workshop invitations, and so it was about spreading the word, because for the most part, in the mainstream, people didn't know what a labyrinth was at that point. But in 1998, the New York Times front page article, below the fold, announced the Labyrinth movement, and that was May 12th, 1998. And it's been increasing ever since then, because that term even gives a sense of cohesiveness to what we're doing. We're getting labyrinths in places where people need them. And people need them anytime they have time on their hands, for instance in a prison, but also when people want to go for prayer, for healing, for just kind of clearing the mind. When you have something that's really bothersome to you, you can go into a labyrinth, quiet your mind, and it's kind of like pulling away the knots that you might be holding in your heart. You can deal with anger. You can deal with an unforgiving heart, whether it's yours or someone else's. Grace Cathedral, even increasingly now, is becoming a pilgrimage cathedral in San Francisco. And the whole sense of it kind of gaining ground was through the training and through people coming to the cathedral. I was very lucky, and I feel almost divinely based that here Grace Cathedral was a perfect place to open the labyrinth.
I always love walking the labyrinth when I'm at a time of change or decision. And so what I brought into the labyrinth this time was some questions about what my next steps, my literal steps, my life steps should be. And walking helps center me and help me come to choices and decisions.
I was divorced last year and have been navigating a lot of grief and heavy pain. So yeah, I entered the labyrinth, and there was many other people walking it as well. And I actually felt really joyful seeing all these other people walking the path with me. It was a sense of community. I was actually really pleasantly surprised with the joy that I felt as I walked, that I began to dance on the path. There was some music playing, and I began to dance with the music in how I stepped, which was really fun. I got to the center of the labyrinth and just felt really deep peace. The woman who had talked to us before we walked the labyrinth had said sometimes people walk into the labyrinth as a form of relief, releasing, letting go of what's burdening them, and then when they walk out, sometimes you feel that peace. And I kind of had an opposite experience of feeling the joy coming in, coming into that center space. And then as I left, that's when I was able to let go of deep hurt and grief that I've been holding on to and not knowing how to set it down or make sense of it. So the labyrinth was really helpful for me to make my next few steps in healing and moving forward in my life.
I often think of the labyrinth as a string bass. You know, it can go in a symphony hall, it can go in a jazz band, and it can be in a string quartet. And it has that kind of versatility for people. And so really our task is in the labyrinth movement is to educate people. There are many kinds of labyrinths. Which one works for you? I think that's a central question.
To me, to sing close to the labyrinth, accompanying pilgrims on the labyrinth is kind of the ultimate experience for a musician like me who dedicate my music to sacred singing, because to accompany a living ritual is like really embodying music in the present moment. There is no more me as a musician with the public out. We are all together, and my voice is not also my voice. It goes in the space, and it's not anymore my voice, it's the sound of the cathedral. And what is absolutely wonderful and gorgeous with the Chartres Cathedral acoustic is that when you put out the chairs of the labyrinth, the real acoustic of the cathedral becomes alive, and it has a profound sound, very intimate, very deep, very large.
Quand voilà fleur nouvelle fleurir en la praère, leur chante chanson nouvelle de la Vierge pucelle, qui d'où lait de sa mamelle le roi l'état, qui de sa chardine belle tosno rachata.